the Start Broadcast button on the GoToWebinar control panel. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
I'm not sure that's not the best.
Yeah.
What do you got?
Can
What are your
you, how
records?
much more extension on those? You don't need 30
easier if I sit in the middle of you two.
Yeah, probably. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. In the room with me here, I've got David Clark, the Executive Director of the Ontario Liberal Party. My name is Mike McNeese, helping out with operations on the campaign. Jamie Kippen is also here, who's doing field for the campaign, and Dominic Batondo, who's from Data Sciences. So hopefully with the four of us here, we'll be able to answer most any question you have. We do have a deck that you'll see on your screen now. We're going to run through that quite quickly, and then we'll have some time set aside for questions after the fact. One thing I'll just open with is that some of you may have done this before, some of you may have not. So I'm just going to put a quick poll up on the screen. And if you could take a second and just click yes or no as to whether you've run an E-Day before, we'd appreciate it. Thanks so much for voting, folks. We see here that the vast majority of you haven't actually run an E-Day before, which is completely okay, of course. One thing Dave Clark just mentioned too is that there's several campaign managers on the line, which is great. Provided you're running your own E-Day, or you can run someone else through this training and through the deck, that's great as well.
So with regards to the sort of the theory behind why we get out the vote on election day, there's only two paths to victory ultimately. You either persuade new supporters or you get more of your supporters out to vote. And a well-run voter identification program can actually boost your own vote share by up to 10%. And I want that number to sink in for a bit because there's getting out the vote is one of the few things that you have the ability to actually increase your vote share by such a significant amount. And every vote counts because not only do we want to win, but we also need to make sure that we're maximizing our per vote subsidy. We actually get subsidized for every vote we get in this election. So keep that in mind as well.
Thanks, Dom. And just one quick note on that last slide is that 10% number really shouldn't fall from your mind because it's rare and it's potentially the only opportunity you have to really make that kind of a bump in your numbers at the end of the day. So next up, we're just going to talk about a few of the things that are new in 2018. The first piece really being the electronic vote and the electronic vote tabulators. That really eliminates the need for a great deal of volunteer work, and it helps you from having to send folks to the polling place at all. It also means the count's instantaneous and we get results right away. Just in terms of the implementation of this new electronic vote, 90% of electors in the province will vote at a technology poll, but that's not to say that you in your riding won't have paper-only polls. It's important to take into account that it's 90% of electors and not 90% of all polling locations or ridings.
Important to keep in mind also that obviously this is a new technology. Many of you may be familiar with it from local municipal elections. A lot of municipalities have been using these tabulators for some time, although the technology is constantly improving. And then the other thing to keep in mind is, of course, that it is technology. They are machines and they are operated by human beings, and so there are going to be mishaps. Elections Ontario is sort of very upfront about this. In an ideal world, the technology polls, the electronic tabulators, the Wi-Fi and all of those polling places, the database to which all of that data is uploaded, and our own database, Liberalist and Minivan that your canvassers will be using will all be working flawlessly. But across 124 ridings, a week of advanced polls, and a very long election day, things are going to go wrong. And so I think it's important for campaign managers, candidates, GOTV chairs, and volunteers to sort of have that in mind, that things are going to go wrong and it's not the end of the world, and just be prepared for those inevitable technological mishaps and sort of work that into your plan, stay calm, and work through it. I'll just finish off the slide here. A couple of other things that are different this time around is that we actually have a full week of advanced polls. Advanced polls start next weekend, so not this weekend, the long weekend, but the following Saturday, and they run for a full week. So we'll get into a little bit more detail on that, but that's a really great opportunity this time around to mobilize particular communities or different demographics that may have a lower traditional turnout. And then the last thing we would note that's new in 2018 that you're already probably noticing on your daily canvasses. It's still not a perfect technology, but the last time provincially or even federally 3 years ago that we all used this technology on a regular basis, the technology has just been constantly improving. And so we hope that you'll have the confidence in the technology to use it to your advantage.
So just touching on what David finished off there and some of the new things this time around, the reality is that the more things change, in some respects, the more they stay the same. So paper polls do still exist. I mentioned 90%. That leaves 10% of electors who will be voting at a what we're calling in this deck a paper poll. So in some ridings, more than half of voters will vote at those polls. And GOTV getting out the vote in those paper polls is the same as it's always been in our past campaigns. So aside from technology, E-Day largely looks the same. So if you've done this before, if you haven't and you've got someone you can lean on for some advice, their advice will still be very valuable to you. So kind of the core of what we want to drive home with this presentation is that there's three separate categories really and three separate opportunities, tools in your toolbox, so to speak. Those being special ballot, which is open now until June 6th, advanced polls, which open May 26th, and then election day, of course, on June 7th. So you can use these three tools to balance your whole workload and then drive out more of your vote based on different groups. So first, just to touch on the special ballot, these votes take place either by mail, but most often in a vote at the returning office itself. They happen throughout the writ period, and the local voting hours can vary, but they typically follow the hours of your local returning office itself. It is a bit of a time-consuming process, and it's a write-in ballot, so they're a bit more vulnerable to being spoiled. So we do want to ensure that folks know the name and the correct spelling of the candidate they're voting for, just to avoid any spoiled ballots. And you see the link there. We've sent this deck around in advance, so you can click that link for some further resources from Elections Ontario. And on to advanced polls. So these have set locations. Folks can vote at any of those set locations. And they're also open for a set time, May 26 to May 30. And they're open 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. There's one weekend that's captured in that time period. And that's critical because you've got those full 2 days to pull out your ID'd support, and you can also ID new supporters that weekend as well.
So I guess now we'll take an opportunity to look at who should you be targeting to vote in each of these different, or using each of these different voting tools. So the first group, special ballot, as Mike mentioned, it's a group. It's voting by special ballot is a bit more. Requires a bit more work. You do have to go to the return office. You'll have to write in the name of your candidate, and you'll have to make sure that's done correctly. So obviously we're not here to advise you that you should try to get every one of your voters and supporters to vote by special ballot, but there are some low-hanging fruit within your voter universe that you should target. You should go and encourage any of your current volunteers to go vote by special ballot. You're going to need your volunteers more on advanced poll day and election day to help pull the actual vote. So please, if you do anything over the long weekend, over the course of the next couple of days, is plan out how you're going to get all your volunteers to go vote by special ballot. Take them all as a group. Go make a bit of an event out of it if you want to, but get them to vote, because you're going to need the last thing you need is a volunteer leaving at 6 o'clock on election day because they forgot to vote, and they need to go do it then. So get it out of the way. In addition, in some ridings, some of our candidates have large and extended families. Often their family members are looking at ways to get involved in the campaign and help their loved ones out. Task a family member with getting all the family members to go other family members to go out and vote by special ballot early on, so then you can use them on election day. Get creative with this. Sit down with your candidate. They may have a personal network that you could tap in and just take advantage of those small and close-knit networks. But don't overextend yourself. Realize that it is, as Mike mentioned, very vulnerable to being spoiled if the name is misspelt, and just make sure that all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed on that one. For the advanced poll, and when you think about it, after this long weekend which we're about to go into, advanced polls are really going to be only 4 days away from starting. You need to go and motivate or think two ways is what we're going to encourage people to do. Think geographically and think demographically. Think geographically in terms of there are set voting locations in your riding. You should know these by now. You need to go and you need to look at the groups that are most concentrated around those voting locations and encourage those ID Liberals to go out and vote and take advantage of close by advanced poll voting locations.
One thing I would just add on advanced polls is not to underestimate the value of it. An anecdote that I like to go back to frequently is a friend of mine who is the campaign manager for the now Minister of Infrastructure federally, Amarjeet Sohi, put a huge focus on advanced polls. It was there was a large multicultural community within the riding that they were targeting, and he actually lost on election day. The other candidate, the Conservative candidate, got more votes on election day, but because they got a significant number more votes in advanced polls, they ended up winning by less than 100 votes, a very closely contested seat. So that's the great thing about advanced polls is you can really focus on those particular demographics and those key groups that you need to support you, particularly if you also need them to help you pull vote on election day. And, so it really can make the difference between winning and losing in the end.
No, that's a great point. You need to also be thinking about all those different community groups in your ridings and how you can use the extra advanced poll voting days to take advantage of all that and to engage your community leaders, task them with lists, and have them go out and pull vote to those voting locations. And finally, obviously, Election Day is the big game, and we need to make sure we get all of our identified Liberals to the polls on that day as well.
So one opportunity that advanced polls or advanced voting gives us is the opportunity to run a mini election day. So you can identify, like Jamie spoke to, one of those advanced poll locations with a dense population of Liberals around it, and close to the location, of course. And then you could treat that like a mini election day. So you can establish a home center or multiple home centers, involve your captains and some other E-Day volunteers. And you can, of course, have those drivers ready to assist voters. And it's also a good time, timing-wise, to call ahead and confirm ride requests for Election Day proper.
One thing we don't have in here is a specific suggestion for when to do that. I would say it's totally up to you on what works for your campaign, which day to pick for your mini election day. But 2 great days would be either the Saturday or Sunday of advanced polls, which is, next weekend, or perhaps the Thursday of advanced polls, which is exactly 1 week before Election Day, giving you enough time to work at the kinks of your Election Day, as well as, it's a nice, convenient sort of time chunk before the actual Election Day to do it. So whatever works for you, but we would suggest maybe the weekend before or the Thursday before Election Day.
Yeah, exactly, and it's as we all know, Election Day is a major logistical operation. So don't leave anything don't take anything for granted. Run a mini E-Day if you can, and definitely encourage your volunteers to pull all the support that you have to the advanced polls. But one thing we are going to encourage folks to do, and it's a question we always get, is you don't want to use your resources just to pull for advanced polls. We're going to encourage folks, and we'll talk about this later on, to do a hybrid canvass where they're going to identified Liberal doors, pulling them to vote, but at the same time going to other doors to still identify the vote. So it's a hybrid, it's a knock pull canvass for advanced polls.
So just in terms of Election Day itself, this is a bit of a simple slide, but it's a pretty fundamental one, and it just speaks to more broadly what your goals will be on Election Day. We'll get into some of the technical, more detailed pieces of Election Day, but really what you're trying to do and what you're doing already is preparing your supporters by identifying them. Then you're telling them where they're going to vote, and then you're going to, on election day proper, you're going to remind them to vote and then track whether they voted, and then repeat those steps over and over again until they do get out and vote. So some of the early planning that you can undertake for election day itself is you can start to identify your volunteers. You'll see the first bullet here says that it's ideal to have up to 250 volunteers dedicating at least part of that day to pulling out your identified vote. We realize that that's not possible in every riding in the province, but it's really sort of an ideal situation, and it allows you to get everything done that you would need to. So with the volunteer piece comes training, and you'll need to show your folks how to use bingo sheets, walk lists, and minivan, of course, given the new changes on election day. Another thing, too, if possible, is to find a lawyer who can volunteer or at least be on call for the day. And then one thing I'll note on the legal piece is that we have a legal and compliance team here at campaign headquarters that'll be on standby for you throughout the day as well. So you can reach out to your regional lead directly on election day, and they'll loop you into those folks.
You can also send any requests, not just on GOTV days, but any day of the campaign, to legal@ontarioliberal.ca, and we can assist you with that. There's a whole group of us on that email account, and we've been getting a lot of good help, I think, to folks throughout the local campaigns for the last week or so.
So the next important piece of planning you can take on early is to find your home centers, and you'll want to determine those by level of support, density of support, and also the geography of your riding. And with those home centers, you'll of course need home center captains, someone to lead the charge in each of those sort of subregions. So you can plan for 5 or more home centers, or fewer depending on the size of your riding, of course. And then it's time to procure the stuff that folks may forget about, frankly. You're using a friendly supporter's house, so you'll want to bring your own food, office supplies, cell phone chargers, even a power strip, given folks are going to be using their cell phones quite a lot. You can set up sort of an ad hoc cell phone charging station with that. You can bring along you should bring along toilet paper and cleaning supplies as well. You can have, of course, the home center captain, and then another captain to help them out.
Before you jump to the next slide, Mike, I think it's a good time to mention that all your lines are muted. So this is right now a one-way presentation. But two things, at the end of the presentation, we'll be taking questions, and you're able to ask your question verbally if you wish, just by raising the flag that you like to do so. But I also see that we've also already got a couple of questions from listeners that have been typed in. We did the first one of these webinars a few days ago, and we probably got 20 or more questions. We're going to wait until the end to answer all the questions, but as we're going through, if anything comes to mind and you've got a question that you'd like answered or more clarification, just type that in and we'll make sure to answer all those questions at the end of the webinar. And also, did you circulate the FAQs?
I did, yeah.
Okay, and then so we also have sent around all the questions that were asked last time. We're considering that to be a living document. So any new questions that we get tonight that weren't asked last night, we'll continue to add to this. So no question is a dumb question, and in fact, by asking it, you're just making hopefully our presentation a little bit better and helping the folks that'll come after you as well.
Great, and some of the things that were mentioned here is there's quite a bit of obviously logistical components to planning for an election day, and from big things like cutting your list to smaller things like making sure you have toilet paper for your home centers. You know, this weekend coming up, we do expect there to be a slight lull in the amount of volunteers coming in to volunteer on election. So it is important that you take advantage of this weekend. Don't let it go to waste, and you can actually plan your trips to Walmart and other places to procure these supplies while there's a bit of a lull over the long weekend.
So next up in the election day planning is to build your voter contact plan. You've already been out there working hard to ID your supporters by phone and by door, but you can sort of ramp that up ahead of election day with paid live calling and direct mail as well. And then on E-Day itself, you'll be dropping or should drop You Vote At cards and then knock throughout the day. One important note, I mentioned the hours for special ballot and advanced poll. The voting hours for election day itself are 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., and that's across the province. Next important piece of planning is your E-Day kits. So Jamie spoke to cutting your lists. You may not be able to cut your lists until your universe is closed, so to speak, and you've got all your IDs in the system, but you can prepare a great deal of the materials in advance for your kits. You can, of course, plan out your zones and divide your big super polls into more manageable turfs or the turfs you've been using already. You can decide where you'll be using minivan on those electronic polls, and then you can print and organize the paper kits themselves. And then one note, the last bullet here I'll just mention is that all the materials, most any material you'll need for E-Day in terms of paper, like instructions or packing lists, will be posted to your campaign's Dropbox account as soon as tomorrow. So we hope to get those up and live, and there'll be an email going out to let folks know that they are up there.
For those that aren't campaign managers on here, if you need access to your candidate's Dropbox, just talk to your campaign manager because they should have access already.
So some of the contents, and the next two slides are a couple of lists, and these lists, like I mentioned, will be included in the Dropbox materials. So some of the things that will be in your walk kit will be some volunteer instructions just to kind of shape folks' day. Like I mentioned, you'll be training them, but they may need to or want to consult these instructions throughout the day. Another one is a building access memo, which just reinforces their right to be able to canvass in a condo or an apartment building. The Victory Party flyer is important. It gives information on where people should drop their kits off, and also where to head to the party, of course. A poll map, so a map of which area they'll be walking or which turf. And then their list, of course, and a bingo sheet that they'll be picking up throughout the day or using on minivan. Home center packing, similar, and again, this list will be in the Dropbox, so I won't go through it entirely. I'll just note that there's some supplies to take note of. One of which is toilet paper, which of course you don't want to forget, and then all your reference materials, so your GOTV kits, your zone maps, and your volunteer sign-in sheets and the like.
Yeah, and these aren't complete and total lists. If you have any ideas, they're probably good ideas. So share them with us. Feel free to build them into your lists. One thing I know I've done in the past is because it's an election day where we can get some rain. If you want to go out to the dollar store and clear out their dollar ponchos, it's not a bad idea to make sure your volunteers stay dry in case the weather turns on us that day. But get creative with these lists, and we'd love to hear any ideas you may come up with.
And the point I always like to make about these is you think of it like leave no trace camping. Typically, your home centers are dedicated volunteers or supporters of the candidate and offering up their homes for the day, often not totally sure what's actually going to be happening there. And so you want to, just from like a stakeholder management perspective, you want to try to leave the house as you found it. And that's why you want to bring all these things in, clean up at the end, and leave it like you found it. Yeah.
Just some of the process around election day. We touched on the fact that there's going to be electronic voting, which is of course a huge change. And then a couple things that Elections Ontario has changed accordingly is that they're using a new ballot, which is a large sort of letter size 8.5 by 11 sheet that gets fed into that automatic vote tabulator. And with the new system comes new bingo sheets as well, which we'll show a sample of in the next couple slides. And of course they'll be using those tabulators that I mentioned in the electronic or super poll voting locations. Because of that, a couple things that have changed for us. Now we can use a minivan to pull vote in super polls, which really cuts down on a lot of our time and allows us to really focus our efforts. And then it also allows a central campaign to strike off voters for you electronically and automatically. So your minivan will update throughout the day. So you won't be targeting Mike McNeese and Dave Clark, who voted at 11 a.m. when you're out at 5 p.m., which is great, and it's a welcome change. So just an example here of that new ballot. This isn't totally to size, but all the folks on the line know what a letter size sheet of paper is. So this will be expanded, and then of course, depending on the number of candidates, could potentially fill that page. And this gets fed in and read sort of like a Scantron sheet in the electronic tabulator. So the new bingo sheets, this is in a voting location without technology. So the old paper style poll, this is a slightly different format, but the grid structure will look familiar to a lot of you. So your volunteers would be going into that paper polling station, picking up one of these sheets and then cross-referencing their paper list. So pulling vote in one of those paper polls is really the classic method, and that's you're giving your volunteers a street sorted walk list, and it's got bingo numbers on it. And as I mentioned, they cross-reference those against the bingo sheet itself from Elections Ontario.
For anyone who might not know what street sorted means, is essentially the streets, all the streets in the poll or the turf are listed alphabetically by street name, and then chronologically by house number. So exactly like you would have seen before, but that's just what street sorted means.
Yeah, so the traditional routine is in place here, and that's to confirm. The first thing you'd want to do is just to go check out the polling location, see that it's open, and ensure there are no issues with setup. And then the first thing you want to do is drop those vote at cards. Those are quite mission critical, frankly, for election day. Folks coming home from work near the end of the day or home for lunch, if they see that card, they know someone's been there and they know exactly where to vote at. So they're hugely helpful. Then once you've done that, you check in at the polling place, see who's voted, collect the bingo sheets, and then cross-reference your sheets and strike them off. Then you'd knock the remaining doors and, of course, rinse and repeat. And then at the end of the day, you'd return to the polling location to observe the count of the ballots. So in one of the new super polls, the electronic polls, you're able to pull vote using cut turfs and minivan, like I mentioned. So the new routine cuts out a couple steps, which is very welcome and should help a great deal on your e-day. Is again, you'd be following a similar but more simple structure. You'd be confirming the place is open, dropping your U-vote at cards, but then following your minivan list saves your volunteers from having to go to and fro the polling place because their lists are updated centrally. They can really stay out there knocking on doors and contacting voters. Fourth point is crucial here, and that's when I mentioned setting up a bit of an ad hoc charging station. We all know that, or most of us know that election day is quite a long day, so you'll want to make sure your volunteers have the opportunity to keep their phones charged. And then step number 5 there is really just repeat, same as always. And then at the end of the evening, returning to the polling place. However, there won't be a formal count of any ballots. In fact, the new electronic vote tabulators spit out a receipt just like you would get at the grocery store, but it's about 3 or 4 feet long, and it just features all the folks who have voted and then a tally at the bottom. And final point on this slide is just that if anything stops working, whether it's a glitch with minivan or a glitch with the updates, or a glitch with the system at your returning officer, you're able to switch to those backup paper lists which you've created and just act like it's a regular poll. So the returning office will have bingo sheets regardless, and you can pick those up and cross-reference against your paper kits.
Most of the questions we will answer at the end, but I'm actually going to take the opportunity to answer a question right now, which I think is germane to this slide. And that's, can you explain in more detail how local campaigns get the count instantaneously, and more importantly, the voter strike-off record? Essentially, every technology poll, which again is going to represent about 90% of electors in the province, is rigged up with Wi-Fi, and as before a person is handed their ballot, they're electronically stricken off the voters list. Struck. Damn it.
Close.
They're struck from the voters list, and that information gets uploaded to a database every half an hour. So basically, OLP campaign HQ every half hour is going to get a download from Elections Ontario of every person in the province that has voted at an electronic or technology poll in that past half hour. And then we will push it to Minivan, and all you'll need to do is update your lists locally. More information will be forthcoming about the mechanics of that, but essentially your volunteers that'll be going around with Minivan walk lists, those who have actually voted will every half hour more or less be just pulled right off that list, so that your volunteers don't need to go to those doors anymore. And so that's how the data push works throughout the day. And then with regard to the specific question of how the local campaigns won't get the count instantaneously, but what you'll need to do at the end of the day is send a volunteer, but just one volunteer, to the polling place where the tabulators are located. And when that number is spit out at the end of the day, just like you would in any other election day, you would call that number into your local office, and that's how that works.
One of the huge advantages our party has over the others is our use of analytics to really bring efficiency to our field program and your ability to identify voters and get them out to the poll. Many of you are familiar who are running canvassing programs right now, or who are on campaigns with canvassing programs, are familiar with the idea of these targeted tiers that we provide. And these tiers are tiers 1 through 5, which are an order of priority on who the low-hanging fruit are to grab in your riding to identify as potential supporters. When we bring this conversation towards GOTV, specifically in the advanced polls, we're able to produce a target as well that we're able to produce an additional target that will aid you in getting out the vote in an advanced poll. And this is your knock-and poll list. So the standard tiers 1 through 5 actually drop out people who you've already identified as supporters. So they only include new people who we need to speak to. Obviously, during the advanced polls, we want to be polling our supporters and encouraging them to go to the polls. So to facilitate that, we created a new target that will appear shortly before the start of advanced polls called the GOTV target and then knock-in poll. And this target will have your identified Liberal supporters, as well as low-hanging fruit supporters that you have yet to speak to through your normal canvassing efforts. And for those people that, we'll get to the next slide in a second, but for those people who are not identified Liberal supporters, you want to knock them first and ask them if they're supporting us. And if they are, you want to use that opportunity to encourage them to go vote in the advanced polls. And that's what this list is here to facilitate. You can use it like any other target as well. So if you're doing a larger canvass that day and also sending out individuals to knock and pull the vote, you can include this GOTV target with your tier 1s, 2s, and 3s, just to create a good mix of both people you need to pull to the polls as well as identify new supporters. If you're running a mini E-Day, then perhaps you would just include this GOTV target for knock and pulling your support. I briefly spoke about how we're going to poll our identified Liberals, but we want to knock individuals who are not identified supporters. And the way we identify these people in Minivan is if you use this knock and poll target, identified Liberals will be marked with an asterisk beside their name. As you can see these examples here, the 2 bottom individuals are identified Liberals and should be encouraged to vote in the advanced polls. This first individual here is not, so we want to talk to this person and get their vote intention, and if they are a supporter, get them to the polls. One of the great things about Minivan, and with this new electronic system that we have with Election Ontario feeding back the strike-off information to the Central Party, it means we can real-time update information in the field and provide your volunteers with as close to up-to-date, as close to real-time as possible information on who has actually voted on their targeted list. And individuals who have voted get a flag beside their name. That's a blue voted symbol, as you can see in this example here on the right. The other thing, we will also be creating a survey question for any individuals that want to track how many times they've been through the door. And this also facilitates the handoff between volunteers. So when a new volunteer comes to take over a poll and another volunteer has to leave, they can simply sync their list, and the new volunteer can download this list and pick it up from where they started. I think that pretty much covers the data component of E-Day and the advanced poll mini E-Day. And I'm sure there'll be some questions on that we'll talk about at the end.
So just in terms of the new bingo sheets, I covered I showed briefly the ones that were going to be available at the polling locations without technology. These are the ones that will be available every 30 minutes at polling locations with technology. So you'll see that it's not a grid format at all. It's just the numbers themselves. And that's because these numbers are uploaded from Elections Ontario to the party centrally, and then we can, of course, upload them to Liberalist and then sync them to your respective minivan lists. So with that, I think we'd just like to open it up to any questions. If folks have a question they'd like to ask verbally, you're welcome to raise your hand, and you can do that through the GoTo interface. Or of course, you can type a question. I know Dave has a few on deck already. You're welcome to type a question as well. Thanks.
Okay, we'll start it off with a question from Lisa. Lisa, great to see you've been paying attention. You got a bunch of questions in here, and that's great. And most of them are really good questions at that. The first question is, do you have any advice on how to divide the new large super polls into walkable areas for canvassers on advanced polls E-Day? Essentially, it's what you've been doing all along. We would recommend that you cut them into walkable turfs. The turfs will probably look a little bit different than what you might have been cutting in your identification turfs, just because they're probably going to be larger because there will be fewer doors within them. But yeah, I would just try to do something that's manageable. But just like you would for any other canvas, just divide them up into using the turf cutter tool on minivan. I don't know, Dom, if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, I think the turf manager is a great tool here. Also, if you have a team of volunteers, depending on how dense your list is, a super poll might be a manageable size list of identified supporters as well. So while they're too big to canvass, they might not be too big to poll. So that's also something worth considering.
And I think coming off of that, Noah had a great question about recommendations for how to adjust your strategy for the new super polls. A lot of people you rightly have surmised, Noah, they're going to say, I'm used to voting at the school around the corner, and why am I not voting there, and why has it changed? And they might be upset about having to go further than they used to have to go. So it's going to be critically important that during advanced polls and for election day that you communicate the new system. Elections Ontario is investing a significant amount of money in advertising the new system. But you're right, people might be upset about having to travel that extra distance. I guess what I would suggest you say or messaging on that would be that it's incredibly more convenient. One of the great things about the electronic tabulators and the way that they've changed the setup in the room is that it's more of a bank teller method. So in previous elections, you might remember seeing, you walk into the gym and there are 3 or 4 tables where the ballot boxes are, and those represent the 3 or 4 polls at that polling place. And as a voter, you might be voting at poll 6, and there are 20 people in line, where at poll 7 there's no line at all, and you have to wait in this line, and you're frustrated at having to wait in this line because it seems inefficient. With the super polls and with the bank teller method, the whole system is streamlined, the voter experience is improved, and the lines are shorter. So while you might have to travel, I would say a strategy might be to communicate that while you may have to travel a little bit further to get to the polling place, your experience when you're there and your time spent there is going to be lessened. Just working through a few more questions here. Lisa, are there going to be templates for things like scrutiny or canvasser instructions for E-Day? The answer is yes. Those are all. We're just fine-tuning the whole suite of products that are going to be made available to campaigns for GOTV. Not to tie ourselves to it, but we're anticipating that over the weekend we'll be able to upload those to the Dropbox. So again, if you don't have access to the Dropbox, speak with your campaign manager. But all of those template documents will be made available soon. Another good question. Confirming for electronic polls, this is the questioner here, confirming for electronic polls that there is no need to have canvassers go to polling station to cross-reference. The direct answer to that question is yes. The way we would recommend you pull your vote on election day at technology polls is that we'll just have your campaigns and your canvassers, your volunteers, relying on the central upload of the lists. Again, reverting back to my comment off the top that these systems are prone to failure, and so sort of planning into your day the possibility that the transfer of data may be delayed, the system may go down, the power might go out, the Wi-Fi might crap out, all things like that are going to interfere with the flow of information. We are going to be monitoring this incredibly closely, and we'll have an alert system set up so that if poll 65 in your riding doesn't report data for 2 or 3 cycles of a half hour, we'll be in contact with you, make sure with your campaign, make sure that you're noticing that, and then together we'll make a call on whether we're going to revert to the old style system of paper lists, sending canvassers in to pick up the bingo sheets, just like we've done in every other election as long as anyone can remember, or if we think we should just wait, allow the system to come back online and allow it to update from there. But in an ideal world, to answer this question, if everything is working smoothly, and we'll be able to tell that from the quality of the data that we're receiving from Elections Ontario, we would suggest that you don't need to send scrutineers into the polling place because there's really not much for them to do other than make sure that things are still working, which again will be verified by the quality of the data that we're receiving from that polling place.
There's a question here about whether or not you need to press sync when you're using Minivan, and the answer is yes. In order to get the new voted information from Liberalist, you do need to sync your list. Once you sync your list for individuals who have voted, you will receive that voter badge beside their name. So when volunteers come back to your home center, if they're concerned about Wi-Fi, when they come back to your home center for a bottle of water or some granola bars or something like that, they can sync their list there. They can also go to a nearby Tim Hortons or Starbucks and sync their list. But honestly, the data size is small enough that if they're not on a super tight data plan, they can just continue to sync their list as they're going door to door and get the up-to-date information.
Another couple of questions here, and I think we'll be wrapping up soon so everyone can get their evening wrapped up. But one of the questions is, I'm assuming we'll know which of our polls are technology versus paper in advance from the returning office. Yes, all of that information is available now. If it hasn't made its way to you as a campaign manager or an E-Day chair, we'll look into that. I will double check. I believe the breakdown is actually posted in the Dropbox, but if it's not, we will make sure that it gets posted, and we'll take a further step of actually sending out the breakdown riding by riding of which polling places are technology versus paper to allow you to plan out how you're going to do your 2 different kinds of vote poll. And then I guess we'll end, not seeing any other questions, we'll end on the last question here, which is how much faith should we have that the processing of data will be done without issue? And is it being tested in advance? So this is new technology at the provincial level. It's been tested over the course of the last year, several different ways by Elections Ontario. There was a dry run back in, I want to say November of last year, testing out the technology, and there were a few issues with it, and some of them were worked out, and I imagine some of them will persist. I think it's a great note to end on that. It is new technology in the aggregate across the province, and probably you'll find even within your own riding, it's adding more convenience than it's taking away, but it is not going to be perfect. So I think we just have to be prepared for the fact that things are going to go awry. You're not always going to have perfect information, but working together with the central campaign, and honestly, you're all smart people in your own campaigns, making the decision of when to, if needed, scrap the new technology method and reverting to the old paper method. Even for technology polls, we're gonna basically insist that you print paper walk lists as a backup and have those at your home centers, because you never know if and when and where the technology might fail, to have those paper walk lists ready to revert to when it's necessary. But, I have a high degree of faith that across the board, it's going to work in the majority of places. But certainly, I think we all need to be prepared for the eventuality that it's not a perfect technology, and we'll have to just sort of, we can't control the wind, as my mom would say, but we can adjust our sails.
And just to the last piece of your question, Noah, I'll just note that the system is being tested in advance. We do have access to the portal from Elections Ontario in advance, and Haven will be undertaking some testing on it.
Okay.
Seeing no other questions, folks, thanks so much for joining us. Like we mentioned throughout those materials, you can expect them. You can expect a note on when they will be uploaded, and then your campaign managers and you will have access to them via Dropbox. So thanks again for joining us, everyone. And as always, feel free to reach out to your regional lead with any further questions around E-Day or GOTV in general and your strategies moving forward.
Thanks, everyone.